May God bless and keep the Tsar far away from us. I'm Sam Aronow, and this is the recap video for the early 20th century, where I talk about things I left out of the videos, correct mistakes I made in the videos, and answer questions from Gaon and Navi level patrons on Patreon. First of all, I'm sorry I'm late. This run of videos is the most ambitious I've ever made, particularly the last one, the melting pot, and I just had to abandon my schedule in order to do it, especially while traveling in the US, which I'm actually doing still as you hear this. Secondly, I now have a subreddit, which is linked in the pinned comment, and I have also enabled Super Thanks, so if you want to give a one-time donation without leaving YouTube or having to become a patron, this is now possible. There's a lot to talk about here, so let's just get straight into it. First up, a minor correction, and miraculously most of these corrections are pretty minor. The prayer for the head of state that is typically said in Orthodox synagogues during Shabbat in the diaspora is actually recited in the Saturday morning service, not the Friday night service. Next up, in my Kishinev video, I said that Chinese Americans had several reasons to identify with the plight of the Jews of Kishinev. News of Kishinev particularly struck a nerve with Chinese immigrants, who knew all too well the perils of Russian aggression and life under an absolutist emperor. But there is another obvious connection, which is that, much like Black Americans, Chinese Americans faced a lot of the same type of mob violence in the US that the Jews were experiencing in the Russian Empire, mostly in the 1880s, but that was still fairly recent. This very lush street is the aptly named Green Street in my hometown of Pasadena, California. And from 1874 to 1885, this was our Chinatown. You can see this plaque here, but it's going to be taken down and replaced because it says, this is the version that says a fire destroyed a laundry establishment owned by Chinese settlers. That's the nice way of saying it. Once upon a time, every town in California had a Chinatown, all the way down to Bodie, which I think maxed out at a population of like 5,000. But almost all of them were destroyed by race riots in the 1880s. Only 5 survived, and those are the 5 that still exist in one form or another: San Francisco, Oakland, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Nobody lives in Sacramento's Chinatown, and Los Angeles' Chinatown was very deliberately moved to build Union Station, but they did survive. And for those wondering, the Jewish quarter of Pasadena was very close by in this area here, but that's a story for another time. Another minor correction here is that while the NAACP did have Jewish founders, Schiff and Wise specifically didn't join until 1914. Also, Stephen Wise broke from the American Jewish Committee because he felt it was too conservative. In 1919, he founded the American Jewish Congress, which has the exact same initials, just to be annoying, and even the two group supporters now get into a whole lot of stupid fights on Twitter. In my segment on the Uganda scheme, I included Nachman Syrkin, leader of the Labor Zionist faction at the Zionist Congress, as one of the delegates from the Russian Empire who opposed the Uganda scheme. I wish I'd had the foresight at the time to draw the portrait of Mayor Dizengoff that I ended up using in the second Aliyah video, because Syrkin actually supported the Uganda scheme. In fact, like Zangwill, he briefly broke away from Coalition to form a left-wing territorialist movement called the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, which is a terrible name in retrospect, but even worse if you know that in Russian, it was often simply shortened to the SS. Unlike Zangwill, however, Syrkin came back to Zionism very quickly, but he never regained his relevance in the movement. Anna K. Rogers, who isn't a patron but is my script editor, asks, would the Uganda scheme have gone less well or better than the current setup, that being Israel? This is something that came up between us in the writing process, and my initial response to that question was what ended up in the video, which is that, despite some fringe claims to the contrary, Palestine had had a continuous Jewish population that was, at this time, growing and thriving. It was the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, and because of that, it was the place that made the most sense. Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, of course, would take that even further with it by saying that most Arabs in Palestine, though we call them Arabs, are in fact descended from Jews. His attitude was, we are one people, we are one proletariat, and we should act as one. My question in contrast to that is how Wasin Gishu would be somehow less problematic when it has no Jewish history, when there genuinely is no historic claim, and that genuinely is just a tool of British imperialism, like some people incorrectly claim about Zionism. And that's either what I said or strongly implied in the video. But then the video came out, and a lot of people immediately started making comments to make me realize that I'd only been considering this question from a Zionist perspective. If you're not a Zionist, even more so if you're not Jewish, and especially if you're from Britain, this question takes on an entirely different character, because the Uganda scheme is happening right now. It's called the Rwanda scheme, and it's essentially the same calculus of a conservative British government getting rid of unwanted refugees by sticking them in another country far away under the premise that it's just a temporary stop on the way to settle these people somewhere else. And the criticism of the Rwanda scheme, which is overwhelming, is not that it's imperialistic or nationalistic, but that it's inhumane, and that it goes against, nakedly, not even trying to hide it, goes against everything the country claims to stand for. What that tells me is that in a world where Herzl went AWOL and just said yes to Chamberlain, which would have been entirely in character, he would have forever after been vilified for selling out his own people in their moment of greatest need. And those who were resettled in Wasin Gishu as a result of this policy wouldn't have been viewed as colonizers, they would have been viewed as victims of a shameful moment in British history. Wasin Gishu would have been seen as basically a prison camp, and you could argue that it would have been. And for the British government to have done this at the peak of their power, when they had the least to do from doing the right thing, that's a big reason why, at the time, it got such an enormous backlash. The Uganda scheme is one of those alternate histories that gets held up by certain people as ideal outcomes because they never happened. So we don't have to think about the real-world implications if we don't want to. And if Israel had never existed, we'd think of it the same way. So in this video, I also talked about the emergence of Jewish professional sports teams. And I wanted to make clear that this is a totally separate discussion from professional sports teams that are notable for having a large Jewish fan base. This is much more of a phenomenon outside the US and Canada because professional sports develop very differently in those two countries. In the US and Canada, sports teams, mainly baseball, which got there first and so it established how these things would work, those teams were always businesses competing for markets. So they never developed systems of promotion and relegation. If you're a second-tier baseball team, you will always be a second-tier baseball team. And it's kind of hard to generate a lot of interest in that. So there are relatively few professional sports teams in America that enjoy large fandoms. In the old world, these teams, mostly originally soccer teams, emerged as workers' clubs. So you do have promotion and relegation, and there are lots and lots and lots of teams. So you can have teams that are notable for having large Jewish fan bases because the fan bases can be that niche. You can't really do that in America. Because even in the largest city, there will only ever be 2 teams in the top tier of any sport. So their fandoms will always be pretty broad. New York used to have 3 Major League Baseball teams, and it could be argued that of those 3, the Brooklyn Dodgers came closest to having a distinctly Jewish fan base. But at the same time, that's only because it was the Brooklyn team, and there were plenty of Jewish Giants fans and Jewish Yankees fans uptown. Why did I bring this up? Right. So when it comes to picking a favorite English football team, it's always been hard for me because in England, the Jewish team is Tottenham Hotspur. They are very vocal about their Jewish fandom, mainly as a mark of solidarity against, anti-Semitic football hooligans. which hooliganism is just not a thing in America. So to be a Tottenham fan was just too obvious. I didn't want to be a stereotype. But then while I was making this video, the BBC told on itself by firing Gary Lineker as their broadcaster, who used to play for Tottenham, for speaking out against the Rwanda scheme, thereby earning the ire of what appears to be all of Lineker's colleagues and most of the fans. For context, this came out after the BBC was investigated over bad faith complaints of left-wing bias, only to have it come out that their reporting was heavily biased towards the current right-wing government. So, out of respect for Gary, I'm a Tottenham fan now. Gaon level patron Saul Cohn asks, we've seen several conferences formed over these past videos, the Zionist Conference, the Jewish Bund. What were the logistics for planning a meeting such as the Zionist Congress? How did they communicate the time and place, organize travel, or provide accommodation? Who was responsible for putting it together, and how was this all paid for? In order to answer this question, I got help from Navi level patron Eric Lederman, who actually is a delegate to the Zionist Congress. Yes, it still exists. So for the first Zionist Congress, and we're just going to use the Zionist Congress as an example for all these others, Herzl personally sent out invitations to whatever notable Zionist figures he could find, and word spread from them to others by word of mouth, because a lot of the people who showed up to the first Zionist Congress weren't even invited. But transport, lodging, and food were not at all paid for or compensated. You had to get there on your own, and you had to figure out what you were doing when you got there. So all he had to do was pay for the venue, and once there had been one Zionist Congress, the executive Zionist organization could then be the ones in charge of organizing these things. And this is very much the same of groups like the Bund. First up, I'd just like to apologize for the sound quality on Ryan's segment in this video. When I was editing it, there were no problems, but after it was uploaded to YouTube, his section was totally blown out and panned hard right, and I'm really sorry if that was uncomfortable. I'm certainly sorry to Ryan himself, who did some excellent work helping me with that. Now, there had already been a steady stream of Western fascination with Japanese aesthetics and design before the Russo-Japanese War, but their victory over Russia really took that to the mainstream. And in America, there was actually a big fad diet that was branded as the Japanese military diet, the diet that defeated Russia. You get the idea. The irony of that, I didn't look into what the diet was, but ironically, Japan's Navy at this time was having horrible problems with malnutrition that was causing a horrific disease called beriberi, which is kind of like scurvy. I did forward this information to Tasting History with Max Miller, but if you want to know a little more of the backstory, I highly recommend Linfamy's video, which I'll be linking to now. So when it came to depicting Russian politics visually, I made a choice to depict the Black Hundreds as a single political entity. But some people in the comments brought up that there were actually two Black Hundred parties, both of which held seats in the Duma. There was the Union of Russian People, which was sort of the name brand Black Hundredist party, but there was also the Russian Assembly, which actually predated the formation of the Black Hundreds, but were essentially identical. I chose to show them as one party for the sake of clarity, because as long as both parties coexisted, they were so closely allied that they might as well have been one party. There was no practical value in distinguishing them, which, in my opinion, just would have been needlessly confusing. Gaon level patron Learnabit asks, since the majority of Jews in Eastern Europe lived in urban areas during this time period, why do you think Shtetl culture, that being the agricultural colonies, is so disproportionately well remembered today? The short answer is because of Sholem Aleichem and his short stories, which were then adapted on Broadway and in Hollywood into Fiddler on the Roof. More broadly, and this really is just my personal assessment, but that's what you asked for. Much like the disproportionate remembrance of the Lower East Side and the tenements, I think it just makes for more dramatic storytelling. And it also dovetails into what a lot of other immigrants and a lot of native-born Americans were experiencing at the time, which was urbanization. How much of country music before the 1990s is about leaving home? And you know, there's a long-standing trope in the US. The patron who asked this question is American. There's a long-standing trope of visiting your grandparents on their farm. And this is mostly people of my parents' generation, if not my grandparents, but it survived through pop culture. You know, grandma lived on a farm. Because before World War I, most Americans did live on farms. And urbanization wasn't just the result of immigration, however much the, populists might have wanted to say it was. Lots of people were moving into the cities from the American countryside. A quick correction here. Only Yitzhak Ben-Zvi met with Cemal Paşa in 1915. Ben-Gurion remained in his prison cell most of the time. He did escape for a little while. Gaon-level patron Nave Tal asks, you explained in the video that the origin of the name Tel Aviv is a Hebrew translation of the name of Alt-Neuland. However, you didn't mention that the name also appears in the Bible, specifically Ezekiel 3:15, as a place in Babylon where Jewish exiles settled. Were either Sokolov or Schenken aware of it when they picked the name for the book and town respectively, or is it just a coincidence? For clarity, the Bible verse in question is thus, "And I, the prophet Ezekiel, came to the exile community that dwelt in Tel Aviv by the Chebar Canal, and I remained where they dwelt, and for 7 days I sat there stunned among them." The short answer is yes. This is absolutely something Sokolov had in mind. But I wouldn't characterize it as the impetus for the translated name. It's just a piece of inspiration he found that made logical sense in what he was trying to convey, the context of a Hebrew edition of Alt-Neuland. Small correction, and this is from Jarrett. He said that newly minted citizens would receive a certificate of citizenship. The actual term was a certificate of naturalization. Another minor correction. The Palestine, Michigan that is on the map in the Upper Peninsula isn't actually the same Palestine, Michigan that was a Jewish agricultural colony. That one, the Jewish colony, was more in the Saginaw Bay City area in northern Michigan, which despite being called northern Michigan, is actually south of the Upper Peninsula. And a final small correction. FDR was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, not full secretary. What's notable about that is that it's the same position that Teddy Roosevelt held under President McKinley before resigning to form the Rough Riders, then becoming governor of New York, and then vice president, and then finally president, which all happened within the space of 4 years, because that's Teddy Roosevelt for you. Here's a weird little footnote. It's possible that we will come back to Jacob Javits in the future, but it's equally possible that we won't. So I wanted to give him a little shout out here because I find him a very interesting character and I actually like him very much. Javits really was, so when I say in the picture, the last of the Roosevelt Republicans, he really was the last of the left-wing Republicans. We talk about people like Nelson Rockefeller or even Dwight Eisenhower as liberal Republicans, but that's liberal in a more traditional sense. They were moderates. Javits wasn't. He was an outspoken supporter of the New Deal, the Great Society. He was an early advocate for nationalizing health care, an equally outspoken opponent of the Red Scare and the Vietnam War, and he was a Republican because he just hated Tammany Hall that much. And he left the Senate in 1981. What a legend. But what's even more incredible to me is that we've actually sort of run into his family before. And maybe those of you who speak Hebrew have already figured it out. Because his name, Javits, is actually an anglicization of the Hebrew name Yaavetz, which is an acronym, which, as I've said in previous videos, though a fairly new phenomenon in English, is something that's been normal in Hebrew since ancient times. Yaavetz is short for Yaakov Emden Ben-Zvi, which means, yes, U.S. Senator Jacob Javits was the great-great-great-great-grandson of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the mentor to Rabbi Moses Mendelssohn. So in the course of discussing the Leo Frank case, I brought up Tom Watson, a former congressman from the People's Party and a fanatical racist, anti-Semite promoter of lynching. Well, I was having a discussion about this behind the scenes with fellow YouTuber Lawarch, who revealed to me that Watson's politics were actually even more cynical and twisted than you would assume from what I showed in the video. And with his permission, I shall quote him directly. "Oh, it gets wilder. I read that Frank's family allegedly wanted to hire Watson for the defense, as did the prosecution, due to his influence and criticism of lynching. But Watson refused to react to the trial until Georgia Senator Hoke Smith came out calling for a new trial in support of Frank. Smith and Watson were old allies in the progressive movement, and Watson even helped him get elected in 1906 as they both worked in the legal and newspaper field. But by 1910, they had a falling out, leading Watson to become more anti-Semitic due to his conspiracy theory that the Jewish community in Atlanta were supporting Smith, and because Smith was critical of the Leo Frank trial, which was in stark contrast to Watson's earlier defense of Jewish Southerners and even noted anarchist leader Emma Goldman in the 1890s. And it was Hoke's Senate seat that Watson ended up taking over. And that is the power of spite. Speaking of which, Tom Watson's Senate seat is currently held by Jon Ossoff, who is the first Jewish senator from Georgia and currently the only Jewish senator from the South. Gaon-level patron the Mac and Cheese Orca asks, why did Jewish voters support Wilson despite his segregationist policies, especially considering Jews weren't considered fully white at the time? There are a few different phenomena at work here, so I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. First, when I say that Jews stopped being seen as white during this period, I don't mean the US Census definition of white. That's pretty much never changed, and even now, the Census Bureau categorizes all West Asians and North Africans as white. The sense of Jews being non-white was much more cultural, in the same way that Arabs or Armenians or Italians weren't seen as white. And for Jews, that didn't really change until the 1980s, even though widespread anti-Semitism had declined, because like 60s and 70s, Jews were really still seen as exotic and other, but in like a fetishized belle juive kind of way. So, except for some rare examples in the South, the discrimination Jews faced in early 20th century America wasn't legal segregation, but de facto segregation. Real estate, education, employment, business. And again, this is something that a lot of quote-unquote white immigrant groups faced at this time. Just ask anyone familiar with the history of Italian Americans. And until a court case in 1948 and the 1968 Civil Rights Act, that was just the accepted norm for most people. That kind of discrimination wasn't something they would have ever expected the government to deal with in this era of politics. Second point, a plurality of Jews voted for Wilson, but not a majority. Although this was a four-way race, realistically, it was only ever a two-way race between Roosevelt and Wilson. And both of them were fighting for the same kind of left-wing progressive voters in the North. Most Southern states were single-party states ruled by the Democrats through segregation and corruption. So as long as Wilson didn't completely antagonize white Southerners, he'd have them in the bag. In truth, Wilson only won a slightly larger share of the Jewish vote than Roosevelt, and that was partly the result of Democrats' historic relationship with the immigrant community. Very few Democrats broke for Roosevelt. If they broke for anyone, it was almost certainly Debs and the Socialists. And at the end of the day, not that many people did. Debs only got 6% of the vote. But if anything specific put Wilson over the edge with Jewish voters, it was that he actively courted them. As president of Princeton, where the number of Jewish students was strictly limited, he had appointed the first Jewish faculty member. He had Jewish campaign advisors like Henry Morgenthau, whom he would then later appoint as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And maybe most of all, he made a campaign promise to break a long-standing trade agreement with the Russian Empire in response to their human rights record, particularly the treatment of Jews. Something you have to understand is that the concept of economic sanctions as a peacetime geopolitical tool didn't exist yet. It was actually something Wilson himself pretty much invented. Up to this point, businesses, especially Jewish-owned businesses, had self-declared economic boycotts of Russia, but the idea of a government imposing sanctions on a country in peacetime, not in an effort to destroy its ability to make war, but to incentivize domestic political change, was extraordinary. And in a sense, it still is, because the efficacy of peacetime sanctions hasn't really proven itself over the last century. But as a new idea, it's certainly something that would have activated Jewish voters and would have kept a lot of them from switching to the socialists, who actually also leaned a bit anti-immigrant, despite mostly comprising immigrants. Again, that's another story. Navy-level patron Jacob Kossoff had a series of questions related to his own family history. All of them were really good, and since they all revolve around a single issue that actually deals with his family, I wanted to address all of his questions. He writes, "My paternal grandfather was born in 1897 in Minsk, traveled to the US via England, and landed in the US in 1910, just as he was turning 13 years old. 14 years later, in 1924, when he was 27 years old, he petitioned for US naturalization and renounced his allegiance to Russia. In the form, he signs his name Kossovsky. However, at the top of the form, he writes Samuel Kossovsky, changed to Kossoff." First question: was traveling from Russia to the US through England usual? Traveling through the UK wasn't the most common thing, but it certainly wasn't out of the ordinary. London, and especially Liverpool, were major transit points. Now, a lot of those who came through British ports had family members already living in the UK, but were effectively barred from immigrating after the passage of the Aliens Act 1905. So a lot of them simply used their point of transit as a means to immigrate to the UK illegally. I'm sure there will be people watching whose families did exactly that. 2. Why do you think my grandfather changed his name from Kossovsky to Kossoff when he was in his 20s during the 1920s? Well, to start, only adults could apply for naturalization. If your question is why did they change their names at all, it was really just a thing to do at the time. This doesn't really happen anymore with surnames, but it does with personal names, and you don't even have to be born abroad for this to happen. My mom was an elementary school teacher whose students were mostly first or second generation Chinese American, and a lot of them had names like Winston or Chalmers. In that same spirit, it was pretty typical for Jewish immigrants to give their children extremely waspy-sounding English names. The problem being, and this is still often the case with some immigrant groups, that they are the extremely waspy-sounding English names of the previous generation. So a lot of the names that people my age would associate with like World War II generation Jewish grandpas, Sheldon, Sanford, Sidney, Morty, were in their own time seen as very waspy-sounding and at the same time very old-fashioned. It would be like me naming my daughter Linda. As to why they decided to change their name in their 20s, they probably didn't, which leads into the final question. Was it normal on petitions of naturalization to also indicate a request for a name change, or was that done through a court system or a different system? Yes, it was common. In fact, it was the most common way to perform a legal name change. So your grandfather immigrated in 1910, which means the 1906 Naturalization Act was already in effect when he arrived. I included a visual about this law briefly, but something I didn't say about it is that it was the first immigration law to standardize the physical petition form for naturalization, which included names. For those outside the US, legal name changes are usually under the jurisdiction of states, not the federal government. And very few immigrants prior to that time actually would have bothered to go through a formal name-changing process. In fact, most underage immigrants already went by an anglicized name for most of their lives before naturalization, and in some cases even filled out official forms under their Americanized non-legal names. I have records from my own ancestors who did this. And frankly, this is a period in American history where the concept of a legal name is only beginning to take hold. In Europe, that transition is mostly associated with the Napoleonic period, maybe up to the mid-19th century. But in the US, at least at the federal level, it really only starts here with the Naturalization Act, and then builds up with federal income tax, and then conscription, and finally Social Security in the 1930s, at which point the cake was pretty much baked. Special thanks to my patrons, including Matthew Von Abo, Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Lederman, and Jeffrey Schweitzer.